Well, let me also add my thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful Saturday morning and almost afternoon. And I do realize I am the one thing keeping you from lunch. But I promise I have a lot of slides to keep you energized here. So I have a tall order today in introducing you to the Abraham Lincoln Civil War and Reconstruction resources at the Library of Congress, of which you've already heard a little bit about today, suggesting ways to find these materials, which isn't always easy, especially online, and leaving time for some Q&A at the end. So all of that in less than a half an hour. So we're going to do the best that we can, but we're only going to scratch the surface in terms of what we have, but Library of Congress staff, including myself, are always willing to help. So please feel free to follow up with me or any of my colleagues if after this you have further questions. So let's get started. The Library of Congress offers a stunning variety of source materials on the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. In addition to the primary and secondary published books and periodicals that are contained within our general collections at the library, we offer period newspapers, maps and cartographic resources, photographs, political cartoons, broadsides and other visual materials, sheet music, and the personal papers of witnesses and participants from the era. I should also mention that we have audio recordings and moving images to document how this period was interpreted later and presented to subsequent generations. So no, we don't have Abraham Lincoln's voice, and he didn't do a podcast for us or anything. But if you're doing the Civil War and you want to document how it's being presented in later generations, we also have those materials as well. Back to my conversation with Dan, we do have some artifacts the way I define them. We have some three-dimensional objects, such as Mary Lincoln's seed pearl necklace and matching bracelets from Tiffany & Company, which can be seen in this Matthew Brady photograph of Mrs. Lincoln. We don't have the earrings, and so I don't know what happened to those. We also have the contents of Abraham Lincoln's pockets the night he was assassinated in April 1865. And I think these are the most personal items that we have of all the Lincoln treasures in the library's collections. And they tell you a little bit about the man and what he carried, since he didn't know he was going to die. Among the items in his pockets were a pair of folding glasses, another favorite pair of glasses, the arm of which was mended with a piece of string, and our preservation department has had to very carefully take off the string and do all that, so we take all these things very seriously. A watch fob, a $5 Confederate bill that he might have picked up when he visited the fallen Confederate capital of Richmond, and among the other items are an eyeglass buffer, pocket knife, handkerchief, sleeve button, wallet, and newspaper clippings that were contained in the wallet. And these are all online if you'd like to go see them. Most artifacts are acquired as part of larger collections, and objects are not a primary collecting area for the Library of Congress. So, but what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is give you just a few representative samples of the types of materials the Library of Congress can offer you. And going through almost everything I'm going to talk about is online in some fashion or the other, just maybe a few things that I have images of that are not. The Library of Congress offers an impressive number of newspaper titles and issues for the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, representing large metropolitan dailies, as well as more local presses in the states. The Library of Congress also has a very extensive collection of international newspapers in a variety of languages. So if your research involves an international element, the library likely holds foreign newspapers of interest to you. And if you spend any time with mid-19th century newspapers, you know that they are really, really great resources for tracking the progress of the war and what was being reported on it, whether that was accurate or not. Evaluating opinions and interpretations about government policies during the War and Reconstruction, determining what news traveled through AP and other sorts of news telegraphs, and how long it took to be distributed throughout the country, and also the accuracy with which it was transmitted. They're great for local color, which is why personally the the Evening Star of Washington, D.C. is by far my favorite Civil War era newspaper, because it's really gossipy. It not only has the local news, but you see what's on tap at Willard's and who's gone to prison and who's doing what. So gossip is great in local papers. as well as the advertisements for goods and services. Those are a hoot. And one thing I will just say really briefly, that with digitization, you tend to be searching for articles and it zooms you in just on the article you're looking for. So your eye does not wander to the very attractive new advertisement right next to it. So sometimes you lose a little serendipity when you're focused directly in on your article. So broaden your view once in a while. The Civil War was a boon for cartographic activity. Mapping of the U.S. had not kept pace before the war, but now military commanders and civilian leaders needed to know where places were, how to get troops and supplies there, and what terrain and environment would be like once they arrived. The library offers both mass-produced and one-of-a-kind maps. This particular map by Jedediah Hotchkiss is an example of a very unique cartographic resource. Hotchkiss was a topographical engineer for the Confederate Army and worked principally in the West Virginia and Virginia areas that he had toured during his earlier geological studies. He prepared maps and produced geographic intelligence for Generals Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jubal Early, among others. And this remarkable map of the Shenandoah Valley was begun at the request of Stonewall Jackson. It measures approximately 3 feet by 8 feet, which required the construction of a special case when we had it on display at the library for an exhibit. So that's the very large case with the very large map in it. But the level of detail in this map, in the resulting map, is just simply astonishing. It shows the offensive and defensive points in the Shenandoah Valley from the Potomac River to Harper's Ferry to Lexington, Virginia. And as you can see, it's not only the topography, but whose houses are where and things like that. This 1861 U.S. Coast Survey map was one of the first in the United States to visualize data in a cartographic form. Using returns from the free and slave censuses of 1860, cartographers mapped the distribution of slavery in the South on the eve of the Civil War. And as you can see by comparing these two, mapping the data is far more effective than just looking at the raw numbers, as it shows the concentration of enslaved populations, not just how many lived per state. And it was not by accident that it also tends to correlate where support for secession was the strongest. And it suggests why West Virginia became a free state during the Civil War. So you can see, and this isn't an accident either, the whitest parts of the map are the whitest parts of the area. So they're not particularly subtle here. And given that the racial distribution in the former slave states did not change appreciably after the war, it is also useful for evaluating aspects of the South far into the postbellum era and beyond. The map of racial segregation on the right appeared in the Evening Star newspaper in Washington, D.C. in May 1954, along with Brown versus Board of Education and other discussions of civil rights. So you may see some striking similarities when you put the two maps side by side, and suggests one of the lasting legacies of slavery almost a century after emancipation. So this is one of the ways in which understanding history really matters, not just for the Civil War period, but also understanding and informing our understanding of the nation afterwards and into today. Recruiting broadsides such as these show the messages and iconography used to attract recruits early in the war. All appeal to patriotic impulses and reflect the localized nature of military service during the Civil War. Unlike later appeals from Uncle Sam wanting you, regardless of who you were and where you lived, or your cultural associations, most Civil War armies were comprised of volunteers who served with their friends and neighbors in regiments organized by states or that appealed to a particular ethnic heritage, like the 3rd Irish Regiment seen here. The freemen of Tennessee were told that the Yankee War is now being waged for beauty and booty, and threatened that successful Union troops would steal their women and their land. The library is also strong in graphic arts from the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, especially mass-produced lithographs representing the war. Some, like this 1890 Curzon Allison print depicting African-American troops in the 54th Massachusetts storming Fort Wagner, were made long after the war. But they are still really important for documenting visual representations and interpretations of the Civil War period itself and later on. In addition to lithographs, the library also collects Civil War era political cartoons. Some are probably very familiar to you, like this one from the election year of 1864, in which Lincoln's General Ulysses S. Grant is pursuing the weak Confederate curs with a literal bulldog grip, compared to little Mac McClellan, who urges leniency in this broadside. As you might know, Lincoln's former commander, the Democrat George B. McClellan, was then running for president against his former chief. And cartoons like these could remind voters of McClellan's failure to subdue the Confederates in the field and the weakness of the Democratic platform to prosecute the war vigorously and restore the Union without slavery. And what you might not see immediately is that the bulldog has Grant's beard. I saw that once and that just made me laugh. The library continues to acquire in this area, and this one is brand new to the library, having been acquired in late 2022. As you'll probably be able to tell at a glance, at least a couple of things are going on in this item. It's in German, which reflects the large German population in the U.S. during the war, and there's significant military contributions of German soldiers. It's also a political statement directed toward German voters about peace Democrats known as Copperheads. They will stab you in the back for going off to war, but then pander to wounded veterans later for their own advancement. The library is also incredibly strong in Civil War era photography and can offer you the usual Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner scenes, battlefield photos, and photographs of Civil War and Reconstruction era notables. But you may also be particularly interested in the Lillienquist family collection. It was started by Northern Virginia businessman Tom Lillienquist and his sons, who started collecting amber types and tin types just because the faces appealed to them for some reason. The collection quickly multiplied and the family donated it to the Library of Congress. And now Tom Lillienquist continues to collect a whole range of Civil War themes, including, as seen here, children and nurses, and many of those come to the Library of Congress. So the collection continues to expand every year. Based on what the little girl is wearing and the photograph she holds, the speculation is that this is a photograph of a young girl who is mourning the loss of her father. And this image of an African-American soldier and his family now may be one of the best known of the Lillienquist collection, because once you see it once, you see it reproduced over and over and over again. And it's completely understandable because this photograph is striking in almost every single way and deserves a closer look, even if it's just being used as a representation of African-Americans. The Library of Congress offers an impressive collection of sheet music from both North and South, and on a broad range of topics. Some sheet music is appealing for the tunes and the lyrics. Sentimental favorites are well represented, such as Kiss Me Before I Die, Mother, and Home Sweet Home, the latter being popular on both sides of the war. Others offer an interesting array of cover iconography and document individuals or events that then engage the public's attention at a given time, or at least the producers thought would sell well enough to make them some money. How else to explain the General Hooker Quick Step, the 1862 Monitor Polka, the 1864 Legal Tender Polka, I'm sure it was great to dance to, and the Sanitary Fair Polka of 1864. And then there are the manuscripts. Where do I even begin with the magnificent collection of manuscripts, which are my particular passion, and many of which are under my jurisdiction? The Civil War and Reconstruction era manuscripts collections at the Library of Congress typically consist of the personal papers of both notables and everyday Americans, and as such, can encompass both their personal and professional lives. Within these collections can be diaries, family correspondence, general correspondence, writings, and ephemera. As you might expect, we have collections representing the biggies like Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Edwin M. Stanton, Salmon P. Chase, Thaddeus Stevens, Frederick Douglass, Claire Barton, as well as the generals such as George McClellan, William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Henry Sheridan, and Benjamin F. Butler. Unfortunately, Butler's papers are not online. I'm really crossing my fingers for those at some point. These are all significant collections and are important for the study of the Civil War and era and Reconstruction, as we've been talking about already. We have been able to get a number of these collections online in the past few years, making them more widely available than ever before. The Abraham Lincoln Papers is a particular favorite for students, teachers, scholarly researchers, and the general public, and I assume would appeal to pretty much everyone sitting in this audience today. We recently updated the online presentation of the Lincoln Papers, adding full-color, high-resolution images which can be searched and viewed at the level of individual items and documents. The transcriptions done by the Lincoln Study Center at Knox College for the previous American Memory presentation in the early 2000s are about half the collection of transcriptions, and they've been supplemented by crowdsourced transcriptions of the other half, or roughly 10,000 items, and they were completed by volunteers with our By the People crowdsourcing project, which invites the public to come and help transcribe documents. And now it makes the collection more discoverable and accessible than ever before. Now, the Lincoln Papers is unusual in offering this level of access, drilling down to the level of the individual item, but it's also one of our most heavily used collections, so it also helps. However, if you just want to pursue some highlights to become better acquainted with the collection, the Frequently Requested Documents page offers hyperlinks directly to those documents. I chose to focus on the cigar box label, partially because I didn't think most of you would ever have seen it before. But it also highlights the variety of material in our collections and points out that manufacturers in Boston were not fluent in Spanish, as Honest Old Abe is written phonetically, and that is not how you spell Honest Old Abe in correct Spanish. But this item always makes me laugh because, especially when it's presented with El Pequeño Gigante, the companion label in the Prints and Photographs division for the Little Giant Stephen A. Douglas. And I have always, ever since I saw that, I thought that would be the best name for a professional wrestler, El Pequeño Gigante. But sometimes the smaller collections of less famous people prove equally compelling. So let me spend a couple of minutes introducing you to a few people you might not have encountered previously. The John Carvel Arnold Papers principally contain correspondence of Arnold with his wife Mary Ann during his Civil War service with the 49th Pennsylvania Infantry while in the Army of the Potomac in 1864 and 1865. Somewhat unusually for soldiers' collections, there is surviving correspondence from Mary Ann, in which she shares news about her life on the home front. The twist is Mary Ann Arnold could not read or write, so the couple's letters had to go through friends who could read John's letters to Mary Ann and then be able to compose ones for her on her behalf. This on occasion led to tension within their relationship, as he wanted more letters from home and she complained that she could not just sit down and write one whenever she wanted to. In this letter from August 28, 1864, John Arnold copied out the alphabet in lower and upper and lower case, hoping that learning her letters would allow her to write more often. I'll leave it to you to decide whether that it's sweet or manipulative or a little of both. Unfortunately, Arnold was killed in action at Sailor's Creek on April 6, 1865, just 3 days before Lee's surrender. I know, it's just such a, I said to somebody the other day, I need to start presenting this in a David McCullough Sullivan Ballou kind of, and John Carvel Arnold was killed at the Battle of Sailor's Creek on April 6, 1865. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do. There are many individual stories in the William Olin Bourne Papers, which is another collection about writing. Bourne was a chaplain at Central Park Hospital and the editor of the Soldier's Friend newspaper, and recognized that men who lost the use of their right hands or arms through amputation or disability during the war faced challenges learning to use their left hands in their post-war lives. Most people wrote with their right hands in the Civil War era, either through natural dominance of that hand or through coercion. Bourne's paper sponsored 2 left-hand penmanship contests to encourage Union veterans to consider the benefits of improved penmanship in the way of clerkships and other useful employment. These outcomes would help the veteran provide for himself and his family, become a productive member of society, and more importantly, prove that disabled veterans would not be a national burden. Submissions typically recorded the service person's own story, but might include poetry, statements of patriotism, or in the case of men like Alfred D. Whitehouse, include very decorative penmanship. And Alfred Whitehouse lost his arm at First Manassas, so he had a lot of time to practice, for one thing. And finally, let me introduce you to Charles Wellington Reed, a bugler and topographer with the 9th Massachusetts Light Battery, who spent nearly the entire war within a 150-mile radius of Washington, D.C., from Gettysburg to Petersburg. A natural left-hander who refused to switch, and I don't know if you can see, but in the one on the top left, he's actually writing with his left hand, so you can see him doing that. But he was also a very talented artist, and personally I think his collection of sketches is still a mostly untapped resource by Civil War scholars and the public, and it is available online in full color, so it's there for everyone to use now. The collection contains several wartime and post-war sketchbooks, mostly engaging in Civil War themes. But Reed often illustrated the letters he wrote home to his mother and sister, as you can see above. You can usually tell at a glance without reading anything. So if you're a teacher or you've got grandkids and they can't read cursive handwriting, you can use this collection just as a visual resource because there's so much that you can get without having to read anything. You can tell at a glance if it's summer or winter, if it's hot or cold, rainy or sunny, and how the soldiers' sleeping quarters change with the environment. And if you thought emojis were a recent phenomenon, think again. In referencing the Army's recent calamities, you're getting there already, with the Union defeat at Fredericksburg in December 1862, Reed renders it as our recent clam-atees. This is technically called a rebus, but I think Civil War emoji is a more descriptive term as opposed to bad dad joke. Now, the big question is, how do you find all of this stuff? Do not worry if it feels overwhelming at first to search the Library of Congress, whether in person or online. It feels overwhelming because it is. The Library of Congress is one of the world's largest libraries, and it can be challenging at first to get your bearings, but it is very worth the effort to keep trying. One of the more important things about the Library of Congress is that collection materials are usually organized and housed by the genre of material. There are many exceptions to this, but generally speaking, cartographic materials are in the Geography and Maps division. Photos and illustrations are in prints and photographs. The personal papers and manuscripts are in the manuscript division, and so on. This has practical reasons in terms of the specialized storage needs that these items require, as well as the expertise of the staff in those kinds of materials. But it has a big difference for researchers who are trying to locate materials on a particular topic, because they may need to look at the individual special collections to find the broad range of things that they need. And each section of the library may have a different approach to how things are cataloged, accessed, displayed online, etc. So if you think of them all as separate entities that kind of do their own thing, then that may help you be a little bit less frustrated. But our collections definitely do speak to one another across the collections. The most basic access is through the library's homepage of loc.gov. The search box at the very top will search keywords across the entire website. That's important to know. It's helpful if you want a full range of options in multiple genres of material, but it can also return a lot of things that are not going to be relevant to you. So the drop-down menu can narrow the search to a genre of material, and the home page also provides easy access to the library's online catalog and to our digital collections page. As I said, the library is a large and complicated institution, and there are often multiple ways to access something. When starting research at the Library of Congress, the online catalog is an excellent place to start. From this screen, you can do a quick keyword search to cast a very wide net, or you can access other search options that allow you to better target your research. And there are also quick links to other helpful resources, including our Ask a Librarian service and many of the specialized research centers at the library. But if you're not sure what you need or what is available, and just want to browse, the digital collections page is a good place to start. This is the most consolidated portal for accessing digital collections across the Library of Congress, or from here you can browse through a lot of thumbnail descriptions of collections to see what might be relevant to your research, or you can or you can use those facets on the left navigation bar to choose just the parameters in which you're interested. So play around with all of these things, because sometimes there are ways of navigating that are closer to what you want. Many of the individual research centers then offer their own portals to digitize collections, most of which can be accessed through that digital collections page or through the home page for that research center or special collections division. So let me just give you a couple of examples of research center specific resources that you might like to explore, hoping that once you've seen them once on the slides, they may look a little bit more familiar when you get there. If you're looking for illustrated or architectural material, the Prints and Photographs Division offers a terrific assortment of online resources. From this P&P Reading Room homepage, you can not only link to the Prints and Photographs online catalog, but it also gives access to other pages with useful information more specifically geared to visual materials, such as rights and restrictions. Now, when you're dealing with Civil War era material, normally you don't have a whole lot of rights that are associated with them, but sometimes materials done later on will. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly if you're going to publish something. So from the Prints and Photographs online catalog, which could be your new best friend, that's usually where I start. When I'm looking for something visual, I start on what we call PPOC. It's easy to keyword search across images from this site, or browse and search a specific collection, such as the Lillingquist Family Collection of Civil War Photographs, the Brady Handy Collection, or a more generic Civil War collection. For freely available digitized newspapers, the site that you will most want to explore, and which is an oft-used icon on my bookmark, is Chronicling America. The Library of Congress hosts the site, which offers public domain historic newspapers selected and digitized by our state partners in the project. So that means that when you're looking at Chronicling America, the coverage in terms of the geographic area can be a little bit hit or miss. So for example, if you're going to New York, you'll see it's very heavily on New York City, not as much in the surrounding areas. Other states, it can be quite different. But it is a fantastic resource that offers keyword searching through optical character recognition, or OCR. And All Digitized Newspapers button gives you more information about the newspaper titles included on the site and the dates for which those issues are available. So that's another thing that you can look at to see, all right, I'm interested in this year. Does the site even have the issues that I'm looking for? In addition to resources for specific genres of primary source materials, the library also has a page which provides access to various subject guides that may collect a variety of materials together on a particular topic, such as the 14th Amendment, which was one of 3 important amendments to the U.S. Constitution arising directly from the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Some guides may just reflect the holding of a single research center, but others can be useful in suggesting a wide range of sources. So if you're new to a topic, or alternatively you're a teacher or an educator and want your students to go see what we've got, that's also a place for them to start. Okay, so hopefully I'm keeping within my time. I know that this has been a whirlwind tour, and everybody's probably still reeling, just through a fraction of the Civil War and Reconstruction resources at the Library of Congress, and a few tips on how to find them. You know, for fun, I would have just included all images, but you need to know how to find this material too, and I don't want you to go home and say, okay, now what do I do? Apart from ask a librarian or my email address, which is fine too. We have really amazing collections on this era throughout the library's holding, so I encourage you to go explore, visit us online or in person, because only a tip of the iceberg has been digitized even for the Civil War era materials. But if you need additional assistance later, my email address is right there. And as I mentioned, Ask a Librarian is also a resource available to you at any time. So if we have time, I can take 2 questions. Okay, Lee.
Hi, yeah. What is the level of expectation for asking to see an item in person as opposed to digitized version of it, or a copy of it?
So the question is, what is the expectation of being able to see something in person if it's already been digitized or on microfilm? So our policy is, at the library, we kind of have competing missions. We want to both serve materials and preserve materials. And the minute you serve it, you've just given it more wear and tear. So our policy is that, at least in the manuscript division, that's all I can speak to, is that if a collection or a material has either been microfilmed or digitized, so that's the preservation surrogate, we will require researchers to use that material first, because we want to try to preserve them from excessive wear and tear. So the way I say it, we don't want our materials to be loved to death. We want them to be preserved as much as we can. Now, sometimes there are compelling questions that can't be answered by microfilm. Microfilm's in black and white, and sometimes you need to see the color of something. If you're on microfilm, I was a researcher at the library for a long time, and for security reasons, we used to stamp this red eagle on older documents, and that's great when you see the original because your eye can distinguish between a red eagle and the text underneath. But on black and white microfilm, it's just all black, and usually somehow they always manage to put it on the most significant word of a sentence. It was never the or and, it was always and blah blah blah, and then I did. And so sometimes that's a compelling reason to bring out an original, to say, okay, you can't, this text is obscured in some way. Now, if you just want to, touch a Lincoln document to get his essence, I'm going to say no to that. I know, sorry. Actually, question in the back, and then, Dan, we can talk.
So as the war's coming to a close, and it's clear the South's going to lose, and then assigning it to Appomattox, was there a proactive movement in the South to just start destroying documents, sensitive documents, and sensitive information? And does that skew, the history? Because most of it, everything we brought up, a lot of it is from the North.
Right. What is a problem, and it's reflected in our collections as well, is just what you're saying, that a lot of people, their personal papers were retained, although not always, because one thing, I'll just kind of veer off into a little tangent. We have the papers of 23 presidents from George Washington to Calvin Coolidge. That's their personal papers. But the thing is that until 20th century records management policies and Presidential Records Act, which I'm not saying any more about. I live in the 19th century, I'm happy there, is that a president's personal papers were theirs to do as they wanted with. So the difference between the voluminous nature of the James A. Garfield papers, who was an archivist historian at heart and kept a ton of things, versus Chester A. Arthur, who had most of his papers burned right before his death, shows you that you can tell a lot about what Garfield was doing, but you don't know as much about Chester Arthur. So that's one thing to consider with all of these papers, is that they could have been purged by the individuals as well. But with regards to the Confederates, so the Northern people at least tended to have more of an ability to keep their papers. But as you probably know, in the former Confederate states afterwards, collections were scattered all over the place, particularly as people are moving around. So some of the major notables may not have large repositories of papers, and they have to be brought together through editorial editions. Or in Richmond, with the Confederate archives, Richmond burned. We're talking about Chicago a lot today, but in 1865, a lot of Richmond burned. And what hadn't been put on trains to take with them as the Confederate government is fleeing south, a lot of that material ends up being burned. And it's an interesting situation that if you're trying to document the Virginia Peninsula, so for, any of you who are familiar with Williamsburg, you'll know one side of Duke of Gloucester Street is James City County, the other side of Dog Street is Charles City County, and at the beginning of the war, and I can't remember which is which, one decided, all right, let's send our archives to Richmond because that'll be safe, and they burn. And so when you're trying to do colonial era research on Williamsburg, you don't have the records for one side of the street because of that. So Now, in the aftermath of the fall of the Confederate government, the U.S. government did try to recover some, it's a Confederate war records, and some of those are in RG 109 at the National Archives. We actually have some at the Library of Congress as well, because some things, and it's a very complicated, tangled history about how we ended up getting them. Some of them came through a guy named Pickett. Not Wilson. Sorry, we were just trying to talk about his name earlier. But some of them come. So we do have some State Department records. We do have some naval records. So it's kind of a little bit hit or miss. But it is harder for the Confederates because things get so scattered. People got scattered after the war. And one final example of having a hard time finding things as a result is in the James Wadsworth family papers at the Library of Congress. Wadsworth being a New York politician who was killed during the war. His wife was trying to recover the contents on him after he was killed. And so she actually wrote to Robert E. Lee and said, I'm trying to recover these things, can you help me? And his response was essentially like, I'll do the best I can, but people have now scattered. And so trying to restore what was once an archive or what was once together is a lot harder for the Confederates than it was for the North. So long answer to a short question.
Thank you.
Okay.